Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you again this evening. Welcome to Toward Equality of Life. I'm here in Boston in the month of January, January 17th, 7 p.m. in the evening, and my guest tonight is a person who was born and raised in Afghanistan, Kabul, Afghanistan to be exact, Mr. Najim Azad Zoi, and who now lives in Newton, Massachusetts. Mr. Azad Zoi was an exchange student to the United States in 1973, and then in the period of the 70s, he went around the country of Afghanistan with the organization of UNESCO, or through their sponsorship, and studied all the buildings of Afghanistan because his love and passion apparently is architecture, and he wanted to study all the historical buildings there, so he has a lot of experience with the entire country of Afghanistan. He graduated from Kabul University in 1979, the same year, I believe, that the Russians formally took over the country. And he was a teacher, an assistant associate professor at the university from 79 to 81. He unfortunately became a refugee after the Russian occupation. He came to the United States in 1982. In 83, he went to Pakistan to be a person looking into the refugee camps of the people of Afghanistan at that time during the war with Russia. He returned to the United States. In 1984, he received a master's degree in architecture from MIT. He worked in architecture in the United States, and in 1993 started his own firm called Azad Architecture in Newton. Also in 1996, he went back to Kabul with the Society of Afghan Engineers with the purpose of seeing what could be done about the rebuilding of Afghanistan, and that was in the time when the Taliban were not yet in control of Kabul and the surrounding area. It was in the time when the Northern Alliance was in control of that area, and in fact, Mr. Azad Zoi showed me pictures of his meeting with members of the Northern Alliance, who some of whom are no longer alive, and one of whom is now what capacity does he serve in?
One of them is Dr. Abdullah, who is the foreign minister.
Dr. Abdullah, yes, who's the foreign minister currently, yes. So
I also met with President Rabbani, too, who was the president of Afghanistan.
And President Rabbani is still alive and well?
He's alive, and he was the president of the country till the formation of the interim government last month, or a month ago.
Okay. He was president until?
He remained president of Afghanistan since he was withdrew from Kabul and Taliban took over. So he, in the United Nations, he was considered to be the president.
Oh, he was the recognized president?
Recognized president of Afghanistan.
Did he literally live in the north?
He spent most of his time living in the north, the area called Badakhshan. He is from Badakhshan. And that was the only area that was not totally under control of Taliban. But he was traveling a lot in Iran and in northern Soviet republics. We really didn't know exactly where he lived, but he was in the north, Talakhan area and Badakhshan area.
Okay, let's talk about what kind of a country is, was, has been, would be Afghanistan before the Russian occupation.
Well, before the Russian occupation, I remember it was a time of peace. We had a government, we had constitution, we had law and order in the country. Economically, it was not a very rich country, but nonetheless, there was peace in the country, and people were happy.
People were happy.
People were happy. There was no violence, there was no terror, There was total peace throughout the country. There was no difference between people of languages, different faith, different religion. And
what religions were there when you say different faiths?
well, Afghanistan is predominantly a Muslim nation, country. But within the Islam, there's the faith of Shia and Sunni. There was no differences between the two. At least there was no conflict of ideology. We had a minority Hindus and Sikhs living in Afghanistan, and they practiced their religion without any problem or interference from the government. It was a free
country.
A free country.
And I must say, I myself have traveled to Afghanistan,
You
a
did,
most
yeah.
memorable experience. And one great word that would describe it is free. In fact, it is this kind of freedom and tolerance, if you will. Not that people tried to be tolerant, they were just so free
Yes.
and easygoing, provided one was not a sloth or some kind of deviant, shall we say. You know
Yes.
what I mean? There were certainly strictures if people did things that were against society.
The society,
you know,
would have been-
crimes.
yes.
Crimes. That was not tolerated. But otherwise, extraordinarily free place.
Exactly.
And some people have attributed the ability for different forces to move in, or kinds of residencies like those of the terrorists right now,
Yes.
having been able to happen because of such a liberal, easygoing attitude of people just allowing differences, allowing people to be around.
To be around. Well, you're exactly right, but things changed. 79, a minority group of communists took over, and the country became...
Were the communists who took over people of Afghani origin, or were they Russians?
They were Afghani origin, but what happened that in 1973, the king of Afghanistan, King Zahir Shah, who lives now in Rome, he was deposed by his cousin and brother-in-law, who announced Afghanistan to be the first time a republican instead of a kingdom or monarchy.
A republic,
So he was the first president of Afghanistan, and the question remained whether the people of Afghanistan decided to do that. No. It was some kind of disagreement or disputes in the kingdom family, where President Dawood, or Dawood Khan, we call him, he was prime minister for a long time in Afghanistan and defense minister for a long time. So he actually had a root in the military power and also among the government sector. So he took over. It was not a bloody coup. It was just a coup. So Afghanistan for the first time became a republican in the
a republic.
Republic, 1973. Now, President Dawood made a few mistakes politically. He leaned too much toward Russia in order to get economic aid and
Yes.
assistance, and allowed some of the communist members to become involved in the government affairs.
Communists who were Afghani.
Who were Afghani,
but they
very
belonged to a
minority
communist party.
yes. But I think the major mistake was that he established a very strong relationship between the Russian army and the Afghan army. So Afghan army and students were sent to Russia to get training. So for a few years he tried that kind of policy, and I think at the end in 1975-76 he realized that he's not going to achieve his goal of getting economic aid from Russia other than getting more political interference into that. So in 1977, 78, I remember, he dramatically changed his policy back. He wanted to become more pro-West, instead of pro-Russians or pro-Soviet Russians. And I think that was his mistake when he changed his view and wanted to get aid from the West and from the countries like Iran, where the king was also a pro-West. And that was his mistake, and I think that ended up his life in his Republican time, and the communist took over.
So you think he should have just stuck with Russia, or?
No, he could not, because he realized that at that time Russia were more interested to spread the ideology of communism,
to have more territory
domination in changing. And I think Russia, I would call it Soviet Union at that time, had a different policy toward the South Asia and Central Asia, and I think wanted to spread.
Exactly, and even at the time I was there in 1972, there was a lot of talk about Russians doing a lot of things for Afghanistan, sort of on a basis of, there was espionage going on at the time, in that area. I mean, as far as Nepal and India and so forth, people coming in from all kinds of, and spreading influence by doing deeds like building roads. Apparently, they built that one main road through Afghanistan. The Russians.
They built the northern portion of the road, which connects northern Afghanistan to Kabul, and the Salang tunnel, which goes through the Hindu Kush Mountains. But on the other hand, the Americans built the remaining part of the road connecting Kabul to Kandahar and to Herat. So it was a balance. The king of Afghanistan at that time, I think he was very successful keeping the balance between the West and the Soviet Union.
So you think, and I want to be brief about this because our time is going to fly here. Yes. We have so much. You think he shouldn't have jumped to the West? He should have just played down the middle and been a little more discreet about it?
It would have been a good policy for him to remain neutral.
Neutral?
Yes.
Rather than, I see. Okay, because going to the West maybe
would have been
aggravated the Russians more. I see.
Yes.
How long has Afghanistan been a country? As you know, in this part of the world, a very little known country, even when the war was raging relatively.
Yes.
How long, and it's a landlocked country?
It is a landlocked country. Afghanistan in the I think it was introduced as a state by the name of Afghanistan by Ahmad Shah Durrani, who was the very first king of Afghanistan. I believe it was in the 1740s.
1740s or so on, 18th century.
Right, it was the very first time Afghanistan was called
How does the identity come about if there's a lot of tribes? How does it have an identity about? Is that an identity? And do people all over the country feel Afghani?
Well, the word Afghan is referred to the people of Afghanistan. And I think that Afghan originally meant to be the Pashtun people of Afghanistan. But since Pashtun had their own name, Pashtun, while some people call them Afghan, but I think Afghan was selected to be the name of, and Istan means country. So Afghanistan means country of Afghanistan. So today Afghan would represent all ethnic groups. Every ethnic groups in Afghanistan, whether it's a Pashtun or Tajik or Uzbek or Turkmen or Hazara, would call himself or herself to be an Afghan.
They identify
themselves in an Afghan. And I think that's something people are proud of that. Yeah.
So it just became a country. People were living sort of in separate areas, maybe seeing each other, in commerce or whatever, but at one point, as states were forming, it came together to be a country.
Well, the formation of that state was predominantly done by the Pashtun. So that is why Pashtun...
And it just
included the southern part in it. But I think before the domination of the Pashtuns, Afghanistan existed for centuries.
When it wasn't called Afghanistan?
It wasn't called Afghanistan.
Did it have a name for that area?
Well, in the history it's called Khorasan.
With a K?
With a K.
Khorasan.
For example, in the 10th, 11th, 12th century, for 300 years, Ghazni was the center, and it was an empire of Ghaznavids. So it was an empire who ruled over the whole region, from India to Central Asia to Iran. So Ghaznavids are the Ghazni people of whose center was Ghazni, and Ghazni was one of the biggest cities in the world at that time. Before and after Ghaznavids, the Ghurids are a different period of history that Afghanistan existed for 200 years. So dynasties after dynasties came under different names, different ethnic groups dominated. Herat, for example, in the West, once in the 14th, 15th century, was a time of Timurids. So even though the Timurids are the people who came from the north of Afghanistan, or even way up north across the Amun River, but we own their time to be Afghanistan's history.
So there was, we get an impression when we look at Afghanistan of there being certainly, unfortunately, a lot of rubble, but also a country that doesn't have much built in it, you know, wide open spaces, a lot of rugged mountain terrain. You went around looking at historical buildings. Was there a lot of buildings and other kinds of locales that had to do with sort of more, not ancient history, but certainly pretty old history?
Well, we kind of divide the historical monuments or buildings of Afghanistan into two categories. One is the pre-Islamic period,
which would be before 700?
Which would be before 700
A.D.
A.D.
Okay.
And that includes the statues of Buddha.
Those were before 700 A.D.? No.
15, yes.
Really?
Yes.
They were that old?
That
and
old.
They were carved into the side of a mountain?
They were carved into the side of the mountains. And beside the statues of Buddha, there were remains in discovery, archaeological discoveries in the eastern Afghanistan in Jalalabad. Archaeological discoveries were made in northern Afghanistan in the Tela Tepe, where the Russian archaeologists discovered remains of a very almost prehistoric era or early civilizations that some archaeologists compared that one to be as equal as the time of Egyptian civilization or Mesopotamian civilization.
So you had the Buddha, statues of Buddha from before 700. Any other structures standing or semi-structures?
Most of the pre-Islamic structures, unfortunately, have been demolished or gone, or through the history, no one would pay attention to take care of it.
So they went by the wayside.
The statues of Buddha remained because it was carved into
it's pretty hard to.
Even that statue before the Taliban's demolition, if you had seen a picture of it, I think one of the legs were blown off. And the head was blown off by another
It was
king.
very abused.
So in the period after Islam came, several people tried to.
Oh, really? Tried to blow it up?
To blow it up. So, but it was so big, so huge, and it was impossible at those days to completely
to have the firepower
get
to
rid
do
of
it.
Yes.
I see. Okay, so then, and after Islam, how old do some of the buildings go back? Which
I think it goes back as the beginning of coming of Islam to the region, which I would say during the 7th, 8th century. Buildings remains in northern Afghanistan in the city of Balkh. I think the very first mosque that was built, it really it has remained, but it is not a functioning building anymore. It could be destroyed now because I don't know exactly the status. There were some other remains, as I mentioned to you, the time of Ghurids architecture and Ghaznavid architecture. And then when Babur came to Afghanistan in the 15th century or 15th century, he built some buildings, but Babur decided to go to India and established the Mughal Empire in India instead of staying in Kabul. So origin of Indian, I would say Indian architecture, if someone carefully study it, it must have come from Babur's time in Kabul and Herat, and when he went to Delhi and Agra, he took with him some builders, and perhaps some of those builders built Taj Mahal.
I see. Now, when I was in Afghanistan, I didn't notice anything too elaborate in terms of construction, for sure.
Yes.
It was very simple construction, at the very least.
Are you talking about the...
In the cities that I was in.
In Kabul? You were
Herat
in
and Kandahar and Kabul.
Are you talking about the historical building?
No, just in general.
Just
in general.
Yes. Well, most of these, like in Kabul, if someone had gone in the 70s and 60s, you couldn't see the buildings because there wasn't much in Kabul, first of all. Even though in Herat, you could have gone to the old city of Herat, where the Charsu existed. Charsu is a cross-section bazaar that existed for years. And it used to be a covered bazaar. I remember the old city of Herat in the Charsu, there was a big structure, a very big dome made of brick. And I think in those days, our investigation was saying that this could have been one of the biggest dome that has ever built of brick. I'm not sure about that, but someone has to confirm that. In the Charsu, there was some architecture, but most of the historical monuments were in the outskirts of the city.
I see.
So if you had the chance to travel outside of the town, you could have seen the minarets of Herat.
I didn't do that because I was too busy absorbing just what I did see. When I ever went to Afghanistan, my brain cells were blown.
Yeah.
Yes, because what an amazing place in this day and age that it was. And like you say, it was coherent, it was peaceful, it was quiet, it was ordered, it was pleasant, it was accommodating.
Exactly.
And people did not have much, but they weren't poor.
Exactly.
They weren't poor. It wasn't a poverty country, nor were they strict Islamists in the sense of having to, carry that banner in front of their person, if you will.
You're exactly right. Music was played or played or listened almost in every single family in Afghanistan. I don't know my father, who never went to school, but he knew how to play a few instruments. I don't know where he learned it, but he learned it. Women's, the burqa or chadari, we call it chadari, right now people call it burqa. That's the blue or colorful
I don't think
things.
it was called burqa, no.
That was introduced to Afghanistan when a woman decided to go to the city and become a modern woman. So that's something people should understand, that Afghan women in the countryside never cover their face. They just walk on anywhere they want to go to their land for crops and or to fetch water from somewhere. The countryside women never cover their face, but once they go to the city and wants to become a modern woman, then they put the burqa. And that's, I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s. But I think in the 70s we also noticed the freedom. There were women in Afghanistan in the 70s dressed exactly the way women dressed in Europe or in the United States. Fashion was coming to the country immediately, magazines, movies. I remember in the 70s, the movies, Western movies was showing in the United States. The next week, it was in the cinemas of Afghanistan.
Do you think then that the Western ways have a big appeal in Afghanistan?
Well, not only in Afghanistan, I think in most parts of the world, but I would say Afghans are very much, could very easily adopt to to the Western way of life.
And you think that would be a good thing?
That would be a good thing, and I think that Afghanistan, the mistakes were made, that for 10 years was under the pressure of Soviet domination of socialist type of life mentality, and that destroyed part of culture in Afghanistan. And then the Mujahideen came, a strict kind of Islamic
What years was the Mujahideen?
Mujahideen began entering Afghanistan after the withdrawal of the Soviet forces in the 1989.
1989.
But I think it took 6 months or 8 months for the Mujahideen to agree upon entering to Afghanistan, while the country was wide open for them. And President Najib, who was the last communist, he was ready to give up the power or share the power. But there was a difficulty among the Mujahideen to decide who should go, who should take the power. And that was the beginning of the Afghan problem in the 80s.
You say they came in, now they're coming from the camps where the refugees are? Where are they coming from?
Well, they were mostly in Pakistan.
And they were Afghan people?
Afghans. There were 3 million refugees in Pakistan, in northern and northwestern of Pakistan. The Mujahideen's parties, there were 7 or 8 of them. I think 7 main Mujahideen parties were based in Pakistan. And I think out of 7, 4 were very radical fundamentalist groups.
They were, so the fundamentalism was beginning at the beginning of, well, it began earlier, but in Afghanistan in the beginning of the decade. So a lot of people had 3 million refugees. People had to flee the country because they would lose their life or because they were being made to live in a bad circumstance when the Russians were there. And I'm saying all this very fast because our time will fly and I want to get so much in. But the Russians, there was a lot of killing going on, right? Right in the street?
Exactly.
Can you just tell us?
Very briefly, when the communists took over, within a few months they realized that they are not the ruler of Afghanistan. Their socialist ideology cannot be absorbed by the people of Afghanistan.
What did they want to do socialistically?
Well, it was a stupid mistake. After they took over, they thought they are in charge now.
Because I heard somebody told me they separated children and parents. Is that true? And collectivist kind of?
That happened, yes.
In some places they tried to separate parents from children?
They took children and they sent them to Russians to brainwash them. That happened. They introduced very harshly the reforms of the socialism. For example, Afghanistan was not ready, and there wasn't much agricultural land to divide among people, but he took the land from the landlord and divided to 10 peasants or poor farmers. And the result was, no one could take care of the land, first of all, and the landlord left the country, came to Pakistan, and the farmers came after them. It was a religious fight, a war.
They wanted to keep religion, and the Soviets didn't want the religion there?
Well, immediately after the communists took over, the people of Afghanistan knew that socialism or communism, one thing they do not practice the religion freely.
Exactly.
So there was a restriction by them. So resistance began and war began, and that resulted that the Russians sent troops. And they didn't send 1,000 or 2,000, they sent over 100,000 troops. And the actual war began against the Soviet soldiers. And that was the reason that people left Afghanistan, 3 million.
So at first the Soviets came in and dominated the government and the country in a relatively peaceful way, in the sense that there was not bloodshed.
Well, it was bloodshed. I think the takeover of the Russian soldiers ended up the execution or killing of the president of the country, who was also communist, in the installation of a puppet regime. The President Babrak, he came with the Russian soldiers from Russia and became the president of Afghanistan. It was a bloody coup. I remember the nights that they came. It took, but it didn't take it took like 24.
It wasn't protracted. It was
within 24
fast.
hours fast.
And then it was kind of, oh no, now what?
Well, now I think that the first policy of Russian soldiers was that they said, we guard the city, you Afghan communists go to the countryside and fight with your Mujahideen or freedom fighters. But that failed two ways, because the communists were not strong enough to battle with the freedom fighters. Secondly, the Russians had problem in the streets.
So you're saying the Afghan people in the countryside were saying, ain't no way you're going to
No
be
way. Right.
taking over here
Exactly.
from the get-go.
From get-go.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then the resistance grew, and then it started to be all-out war.
It was all-out war, and I think the resistance was not only the Afghans, it was supported worldwide. The countries like Pakistan, Arabic countries, and the United States got involved with aiding and funding and supporting the freedom fighters. But unfortunately, these freedom fighters formed these radical groups in Pakistan. Or I would either say they formed or they were purposely organized by the government of Pakistan, that these groups are the only one that they can become active and receive aids and funds. And that lasted for 9 years or 10 years till Russians withdrew. And once
After what, 50, how many casualties did they get? They suffered a lot of casualties, but many more Afghans died, is that right?
Well, the number of the Afghan casualties, I think, exceeds 1 million, over 1 million.
Russian country of what, 7 million people?
No, I think that was estimated
15?
to be 15 to 17 million.
And 1 million estimated to have died.
To lost their life. Today, I think even 10 years ago, you could have asked any family in Afghanistan would have said that they lost 1 or 2 members of their family.
And it was in this period both sides started planting the landmines, both sides, right?
I think it was mostly the Russian sides in order to defend their territories. I don't think the Mujahideen were capable of or in the business of planting mines. It was mostly the government and the Russian soldiers trying to protect.
So already the country must have suffered. I mean, people must have started to get really poor and need food during that period when there was a war going on, right?
The economy got very bad. The farmers left their land. Most of the villages in Afghanistan were destroyed by the Soviet forces. In one of the policy, I think it once was to depopulate the countryside. Let the people leave, so when the resistance fighters or the freedom fighters go inside Afghanistan, they will have no place to be sheltered or given food. So they tried to depopulate the countryside in Afghanistan and destroyed many of the villages. So when people became refugees in Pakistan, so all the land and the agriculture system, the irrigation system was all gone. It was all destroyed. And up to now, it became worse and worse.
Okay. Then the Russians finally removed themselves, but it was a very war-scarred country at that time, would you say? People were like desperate already?
It was desperate. But I think when the first time Russians gave a sign that they are going to withdraw, and I think it was during the Ronald Reagan time. So there was a great joy and happiness for the Afghan people. It was a victory. It was a great victory to challenge a superpower and for the cause of freedom, for the cause of being free to live in your country and practice your ideology. So it was a joy and happiness and a hope to return back to Afghanistan and build back Afghanistan. But what happened in the 1970s, I think the world left Afghanistan alone. There was no one really to help. With the withdrawal of Russians, United States and the West also turned their face and forgot about Afghanistan.
Well, there was great hope and joy, but what I'm saying, this had to also be a demoralized, disadvantaged country at this time. It had to...
It was. I think socially it was so badly damaged that people of educated people had left the country. The ones who were in charge of the government were mainly trained and educated in Russia with socialism ideology or socialism training. And in the coming of Mujahideen, in these Mujahideen were not really equipped with technocrats, politicians, administrators to come and take care of the country. All they knew were fighting, and that was the beginning of the internal fighting or internal devastation of Afghanistan.
In other words, the capacities to get something off the ground and rebuild weren't in place whatsoever.
It did not exist. No, never. First of all, from 1991 till 1994 and 5, it was a bloody feudal. Fighting among warlords. Individuals in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west, in the center. It was a country completely going into complete destruction. It was so disorganized. It was a lack of central authority. So for 4 or 5 years, economically there was nothing, and it was a bad time for Afghanistan.
Right, and if you consider all the people who died, all the stuff that was destroyed, and then all the people who lost limbs from the landmines walking, just tons and tons of people, right? I mean,
thousands.
This has to be, you know, this has to take its toll.
Exactly.
It even has to take its toll on the friendliness, it's like every man for himself, so to speak. You've got to become a survivor. It's got to change you, I would think.
Exactly, yes.
That kind of an experience. And
Exactly.
then more of it continued through the 90s, and then it continued through the Taliban.
Well, then the Taliban brought another darker, much darker age to the Afghan people. In 1996, as I mentioned, and you mentioned that, I went to Afghanistan as a member of a team of engineers and architects to survey the damages in Kabul.
Was it easy to go into the country at that time?
No, it wasn't that easy. We tried to seek which way we should go. The relationship between Pakistan and the government of Afghanistan was getting really bad at that time. But on the opposite hand, the relationship of that government at that time was getting much better with India. So we had to apply through a visa to India. We used our U.S. passports to go to India as U.S. citizens. And then from India, we took the Afghan Airlines to fly to Kabul. And it was not a very easy trip.
Did they really check you out when you got into the airport? How's the security?
In Afghanistan?
Yeah.
They checked. I think their concern was mainly what we brought with us. We had a lot of books, engineering books to be used, codes, construction books. So that was okay as soon as they realized that there are no pictures and things. It was easy. We also had cameras and films and videos. That was something that they became more suspicious of what. But I think what it was that there was an early arrangement between us and the government of Afghanistan that a group was coming. So as soon as the next step they learned that we are guests of the Afghan government, then it became very easy.
So it was prearranged, but the Afghan government is the Taliban at this time,
no,
right?
No, at this time
that's right. It was pre-Taliban.
Pre-Taliban.
That's
yes.
right, pre-Taliban. So that's right. So you did not have that experience.
No, we didn't.
But they were still worried about pictures?
Pictures of, I think some of the security guards who were checking these things, and they wanted to make sure that even in those days, pictures of movie stars or
women nakedly clad,
those should not come into the country.
So there was a lot of precursors to to the kind of fundamentalism that came there with
It
the
was,
Taliban.
yes,
There was, yeah.
We really had I mean, during the pre-Taliban time, even though there were women working in offices, but we found a lot of women on the streets walking, but not very comfortable, the way we used to know. We saw women wearing, not wearing burqa, but still covering their head with a small scarf. So it wasn't the Afghanistan of the 1970s that we used to be around and go around and do things.
So the influence of the schools or whatever groupings, convocations of people in Pakistan around Islam, around the Quran, maybe there's a lineage of influence, maybe from the Mujahideen to the Taliban. Kind of. I mean, that kind of an influence was in the air. It was in the atmosphere.
I think that the atmosphere, I should say my personal experience, when I left Afghanistan in 1981, the very first day that I reached Pakistan, the next day I had to change my Western clothes and wear, long traditional custom. And afterward, I realized that it's better to grow beard.
You grow a beard.
Yeah, it was the beginning that, for me, forcefully, Pakistan was not as open society at that time as Afghanistan was. My fiancée came, and she had to put the cover the head and toe.
When I was in Afghanistan, I covered myself. I never thought twice about it. It just seemed natural. It never bothered me.
Yes.
I just I'm not going to walk in shorts in this country. You just understood that, and it didn't seem repressive. I wore a complete cover on the head, and I always had long gowns. You know, some Afghani kind of things too. Yeah, but I must say, and there weren't women around, and women did wear the full cover, the few that I saw, and there was a lot of, and I went to some home, and the women, were definitely not allowed outside the home or to see anyone but the males in their family, their brother and so on. That was my experience, but it didn't strike me. It never struck me as unusual somehow. And when I reflect back, in those years in Greece, there were no women on the street. No women, and they used to just hug the building late in the day and come out all in black, all covered over. And in Spain, there were no women on the street. So to me, that I noticed that more because those were more Western, definitely societies, So.
Well, I think the difference that I should explain here is that even though in the 1970s you didn't see that much freedom for women that you could expect from others, but I think that the difference is that it was the choice of people. It wasn't like the government to say, hey, you cannot come outside without that kind of dress. The women were allowed to uncover long before, I think, the very first time we have pictures of King Amanullah in the 1919, where he went to a tour in Europe for 6 months with his wife, Soraya, and she came back to Afghanistan with a round hat, European hat, and uncovered in European dress. That was the beginning of the freedom of women in Afghanistan to come outside. But then it was led to the choice of the families, their specific tribal background, thinking, ideology. It wasn't forceful to say, do this or don't do this one. Like my family was open. My sisters, my mother, they never worn the chaudhary or the burqa. It was our own choice to do. The government simply let the people to do what they desire to do.
Well,
And the society also
the government
accepted.
had very little to do with what the people did. The people just did, you know?
Did what they wanted.
And yet
yes.
it was hardly a lawless society. That's what's so unusual.
Exactly.
It was a very well-ordered society. Everything worked, and nobody was making people do anything.
My school time in the 1960s and 70s, I cannot recall any single violence, killing. There was nothing that I can remember that was, if someone was killed due to something, it would have been a big news in the country, throughout the country. You could travel throughout the country without fear, without. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s and 70s, there were thousands and thousands of tourists came from Europe to spend their time in Afghanistan because it was a place really to go and visit. And the tourists, he wrote in the 1960s when I was doing a research, as you mentioned in the early, half of the Herat Bazaar, I remember, was European tourists and half were Herati Afghans. And the restaurants, kebabis, you couldn't find room to have lunch or dinner because it was full of European tourists.
Like, for example, I used to go eat breakfast at one restaurant every day, and they would play Traffic. They had some Western music. They didn't like it at all. But, you know, they didn't care because we liked it.
Yes.
They just play the music, you know, and everybody enjoyed it. You know?
Yes.
That's how it was.
Yes.
And they made some chocolate cake and it didn't taste like chocolate cake, but they made things that, you know, we thought we would like, you know. So, yeah. So anyway, well, we're coming to the end here shortly. Now we know we've got some, you know, the country must be in really tough shape now, right now.
It is a very tough shape, but I think there are a lot of hopes, a lot of optimism among the people, not only inside Afghanistan, but those Afghans who lived outside Afghanistan became refugees.
Even with the suffering, there's got to be.
Well, we do have the pressure, but I think the removal of Taliban from power was a good news to all Afghans, and elimination of the Al-Qaeda terrorist groups from Afghanistan is a great news, and it's welcomed by all Afghans. And we are looking forward this coming spring to be a good year, I think, for Afghanistan. We're looking for the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Afghanistan.
How cold is it there now in the winter time? Is it?
It is cold, and it varies. I think the good thing about Afghanistan is that the climate changes or varies so much within. From Kabul to Jalalabad is about 60 or 70 miles distance. You can take a trip in 1 hour, but that means you go from Massachusetts to Florida. That kind of weather you can see. But in Kabul and central Afghanistan, it's pretty much cold. It really gets
colder than here in Massachusetts?
I would say it would be colder at some part of the winter, but it's so regular. I think when they say 3 months winter, it's 3 months winter there. And the hardest one is the 2 months of winter in the middle. But it does snow, and it does get very cold and icy.
And you see that the people in the country, they say no shoes they had on and stuff, you know, on TV. You see that, or they have just stockings on their feet with some sandal-type shoes.
Well, I would be very much concerned if we talk about the condition of the people, the concern about those people who have lost their homes and they became internal refugees, and they live in camps and tents. And I'm not sure whether the aid packages gets there to help them or not. I've seen some pictures that come through internet, and it does show, as you say, children and women living under a tent in a very cold weather without sufficient food or shoes on their feet. It is very tough, yes. Cities like Kabul, I think they do receive some aid in Fan, or major cities like Kandahar and other cities. But I think somewhere in the remote areas in Afghanistan where people have lost their villages and their homes and they became refugees. And getting aid to those areas are so difficult. So those would be in areas of concern to people to help.
Well, we're going to stop here. It's not for me to say whatsoever, but I think anyone who is not Afghani and went to Afghanistan in the time when it was a coherent, stable country would most miss that. We'll never see that Afghanistan again probably when they rebuild it, and all this influence will be coming in because that, but time moves on. It's no longer the days of yesteryear. So anyway, thank goodness we're very warm here in the studio. Najim will drive off in his car very comfortably and return
Back
to his
home.
architectural firm. I'll be very comfortable as well, so will everyone here. Nothing like what people face in other countries of the world, to say the least of Afghanistan. Thank you for listening tonight, and thank you for being on the show.
Well, Nancy, thank you very much, and thank you for the BNN studio to give me the opportunity to come here and talk about Afghanistan. And I hope I have given the message and the information that was needed for the community to hear from.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Good night to you all, and thank you.
Don't need no money, just call my name, and I'll be there, honey, and I'll eat the pain. If I had $1 million, I wouldn't take a red cent, oh, can't you see? It don't cost you one dime, baby, and you can get it anytime, baby. Say, come and get it from me, my love is, my love is, my love is free. The cost of living at an all-time high. You simply giving my love a try. With income tax and debt, your only guarantee. Oh, can't you see? It don't cost you one dime, baby. And you can get it anytime, girl. Say, come and get it from me. My love is, my love is, my love is free. Oh, I got free love in the morning. With income tax and debt, your only guarantee. Oh, can't you see? It don't cost you one dime, baby. And you can get it anytime, babe. Hey, come and get it from me. My love is, my love is, my love is free. I got good love. Yes, I have. If I had money, I say I wouldn't need a dime. I'm gonna lay the love right on the line. Oh, you can get good love right here, baby. You can get good love at any time. I got free love in the morning. I got free love late at night. I got, ooh, hey, hey, yeah, sometimes I get a little trouble. And time I get so blue. Yeah, oh, babe. But every time I get mixed up inside, child, I think of the love I have for you. I got free, yes, it be free. I got free love. I walk around, I can't understand. I throw my heart up in my hand.
around not saying hello, as we race around without love for our neighbor, without the time of day for human relationship. We face a nuclear winter. Let there be peace. Let us wage peace. To those who bomb, for all the bombing. We can't have peace with bombing. There cannot be peace from bombing. From all the people who were under those daisy cutter bombs. For all the camels in the desert. For all the destruction. For all the fear and heightened tension. For all the aggression. Our love is free. Our love is free. I just threw my heart up in my hand and I listened to the guitar. Listen. Our love is free. Our love is free. Our love is free. Our love is free. The hardest thing to find. The hardest thing to find, to dig deep down in our frail humanity, in our sinful humanity, in our feeble humanity. The hardest thing to find. Dig down beyond the rage to love. The hardest thing to find. Say no to bombing. And for the animals in the laboratories all over the world, right here in Boston, Massachusetts, as we sit tonight, the animals screaming in pain, dying in agony, slow deaths of torture in the laboratories. Let the animals go. They have every right to be here and live a good life, a free life. They have every right as anyone else. Let the animals go and preserve the nature for them. Let the animals go. How dare you dig in the brain of a monkey or a rat? How dare you let the animals go as we sit here tonight, annihilating all that is good and just and possible. Our love is free. 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 Free love, my love, your love, our love. Oh, yeah. Free belief, yes I am. Free belief, yes I am. Free belief, a street driving man. I got good love, yes I do. I got good love, I'm just made for you. Income tax and death, Lord, you got to show me now. I got good. Yeah. Good night.